Hello, this is a video about handling highlights and shadows in Silkypix. I'm using Silkypix Developer Studio Pro 7, but I believe these things work the same in the current version, which is version 8. I'm going to look at two images here, a landscape and a flower. Before I start with Silkypix, I want to have a quick look at one of them in Lightroom. I want to do this to illustrate the sort of things that I want to do in Silkypix. Silkypix can be a bit awkward to use, I think. Once you know how to use it, it can be very good. But I just want to have a look in Lightroom because I think that helps give a bit more of an intuitive view of what's going on here. So I've got this image here. It was captured raw, like the other one was. In this case, using a very small sensor camera, which is not the best thing to use for this sort of high contrast scene, but we want to try and make the best of it. For example, down at the bottom, it's not completely black, but there again you can't really see much of what's going on, so there's a couple of things you might want to do with this. One of them is make it darker at the bottom so it's more of a silhouette. Now in Lightroom we've got these four sliders here called highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, and what blacks do is alter the intensity of the very darkest regions in the image. So if I pull this to the left and we look at the bottom of the image, we can see that it goes very black. If I move it in the opposite direction, we can see it gets a bit lighter, but not much, at the bottom there. So for example, I might say, well, yes, I'd like it as a silhouette, and if I crop it now, you know, that's more like what I'd be interested in. But perhaps we'd want to see what's down here, and by turning the blacks up, well, we don't get a great deal more visibility of it. If we look at the shadows, now this affects the areas that aren't the darkest, very darkest areas in the image, but the ones that are quite dark. And so if I move that over to the right, that area at the bottom brightens up considerably. So what was there at the bottom wasn't very, very dark, but it was quite dark, and it responds well to bringing the shadows up. Now, one of the things that often happens when you raise shadows or bring highlights down, or do both, is that the image can take on a rather flat look because you compressed a lot of dynamic range in, and it does make it look flat. So what I can do here is to go back to the blacks and just pull the blacks down a little bit, which gives some more contrast here at the bottom. In terms of the highlights, I can use the other two sliders, or the bright areas. The very brightest of them, if I turn that up, obviously the very bright areas get even brighter, and I can turn them down. Again, I might do better to alter the highlights, that's turning them up, which isn't very helpful. But if I turn them down, again, I get possibly a more interesting effect. And we can also combine that with altering the exposure up and down, which sometimes you need to do to make these things work at their best. And if we now compare what we had originally with what we've got now, we can see a little bit more in the sky and quite a lot more at the bottom. So that's the sort of thing that I want to do in Silkypix. But it's a bit, I think it's a bit less direct in terms of understanding how it's done and knowing which sliders to push around. If we look at this one now in Silkypix, we've got this drop down here. Let's look first at the dodge. Now, dodge affects the dark areas. I may get this wrong as we're going through here because it's not a terminology I'm familiar with. I've got this slider underneath, and if I now turn this up, it's turning this dodge value up, and we can see that the bottom of the image is getting brighter, and it's having a slight effect on the sky as well, making that a bit brighter. Alternatively, I could use what it calls colour burn, and that affects the bright areas. So I pull that across and the bright areas become less bright, like the altering the highlights, putting the highlights down in Lightroom and lots of other applications. What I can't do is use those two together. In Lightroom I could say, well, I want to do something or other to the darkest parts and something else to the lightest parts, and I want to do those sort of independently. Well, I can't here because I'm either using dodge or I'm using burn. Now I can use both together, that's this dodge colour burn, but the amount it's using of each is sort of in a fixed ratio. I'm still not able to use them independently of one another. I'm affecting both at the same time, but I can't alter the ratio in which the two effects, brightening the dark areas and darkening the bright areas, I can't affect the ratio in which those are used. So what I then have to do is alter the exposure, if the balance isn't right, and get some combination of changing the exposure and altering the amount of this dodge and colour burn to get the effect that I want. And I find that a bit more difficult to do, a bit less intuitive than what I can do in Lightroom. The other three options here are these HDR options, and they mirror the three that we've already looked at. And what they do is the same as the previous versions, but more of it. So for example, if we look at the colour burn HDR version of it, that's having a bigger effect on the bright areas than the simple colour burn did. If we look at the dodge HDR on the effect on the darker areas, again that's had more of an effect than if we compare that to the ordinary dodge and then go back to the HDR dodge. We can see that that's having a greater effect, and again we can use both together, and although it doesn't say it, this is actually dodge / colour burn HDR, otherwise known as HDR. And again we get this flat effect, and we might want to do something similar to what we did in Lightroom, which is to bring the black level down. But notice here that the black level only goes in one direction. In Lightroom I could make the darkest areas darker or brighter. Here I can only make them darker. And if I want to make them brighter, again I have to go back to the exposure and alter that in combination with the other things I'm doing in order to get the effects that I want. So that's to do with the relative brightness of areas in the image, and to some extent the contrast involving the darkest areas. The other image has more to do with colour. It's got an area at the top, and if we look closer at it, where the colours have gone. It's pretty much white there. Now we can do what we did before. I set this, I'll set this now to the Color Burn HDR, which has the big effect on the bright areas, and we can see as I pull it back and forward that it is having quite a big effect. But this still has quite a component of white in it, and there's an additional control in Silkypix called the highlight controller, and you can use this to fine-tune the way that it handles the highlights. This first slider, Chroma and Luminance, tells it, if you move it to the right, you're telling it to concentrate on keeping the brightness as it was actually captured, and that destroys the colour. There's the starting point, which is somewhat in the middle, an intermediate one, and if you turn it right over to the left, it concentrates on doing what it can to get the colour back. That has the effect of altering the luminance, the brightness. If you've got this first slider set over to the left dealing with colour, you can then use the next slider to tell it whether to concentrate on the saturation, which in this case, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the video, but it's gone what to me is a fairly nasty oversaturated yellow here. I wouldn't want to do it with this image. Or at the other end, it concentrates on the trying to get the hue back, the colour as it were of the colour, and again in this case it takes on a slight what is that, pinky magenta sort of colour. It's quite subtle. Again, I don't know if you'll be able to see that. In this case I wouldn't want to do anything with that slider. And then you've got the this luminance restoration slider, which again, if you put it over to the left, it concentrates, or let's do it to the right, sorry, first. It concentrates on, well, it's not actually having an awful lot of difference in this case, but it concentrates on the brightness, and you can use this according to the help in combination with underexposed images. You need to read the help to work that one out. And at the other end, it's got just a fraction more coloration in those areas now. And if we look at the comparison, the before and after comparison, on the right we can see how this image was, and on the left we can see what it looks like now, and it has got a bit of yellow in there, well, pinky sort of yellow anyway in there. So in order to get the most out of its Silkypix's handling of highlights, you may need to use this highlight controller to fine-tune. There was one slider on that highlight controller that we didn't look at, and we'll just look at that now. If we go back to this image and go back to the highlight controller, there's this one at the bottom, and I'm just going to slide it across to the right, and you can see that it has, there's not a very pleasant effect with this image, but you can see the effect that it has. And what you could do in this image is just calm down the edge a little between this very bright area and the rest. So if I moved it just a little, that might or might not be a nice effect. Again, it depends on the image, and I'm not suggesting that this image is better than it was when it started out. Arguably it isn't at all. But this is merely to demonstrate the sort of things that you can do with this. What you do with it, well, how your pictures look are a matter of personal taste, and what an image will give you as you play with it depends upon the image. One thing to just say again is both these images were shot raw, which does give you a little more latitude as to what you're doing with it. In my view, and this is not agreed by everybody at all, but in my view, that's even the case for small sensor cameras. I use RAW for my small sensor cameras, my travel camera, and my bridge camera, small sensor bridge camera. Some people say that there's no point because you can just do as well with JPEG, but well, you have to try it yourself and see. I've got a feeling that some of these effects will work better with RAW than with JPEG. Anyway, that's it. That's a quick look at highlights and shadows in Silkypix. So that's it for now. Goodbye.